Before I start drawing on the board in that, anybody got any questions or particular things that they want me to address? Yeah?
How do you distinguish between like Simpson, Haida, and Tlingit drawing?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, actually. It's very difficult and not always 100% to really distinguish, because it's such a conventionalized system. You know, there's sort of a particular way of doing things, and anybody that participates in that, to a large extent, you know, it comes out the same. And if you look way back in the earlier work, the oldest things from the 18th century, they really look actually even more alike as far as two-dimensional design goes. When it comes to sculpture, it's a little bit easier to tell because sculpture as a whole is less conventionalized as the two-dimensional design is. And when carvers first, like if you're working on a face, say for a mask or a totem pole or the end of a bowl or whatever it is, there are certain ways that have been established by sort of the leading artists through history in any area who did things a certain way, and then other people do it that way, you know, and it becomes tradition in a particular area. So you can tell much more easily a Tsimshian mask from a Haida mask from a Tlingit mask because of the way, even all humanoid masks, just because of the way they block out the sculpture. In fact, if you had three different really traditional artists and you just gave them like 20 minutes to work on a carving, to rough out a carving, even at that point you could tell which one was Haida and which was Tlingit and which was Tsimshian, because of the initial things that they do to create the ins and outs of the face. They're that different. And of course then in the finish of the work and the shapes of the eyelids and the proportions of the everything, different proportions of the face are different enough that you can distinguish those things. But when it comes to flat design, it's a lot harder to tell that. So then up into the 19th century, as those styles diverged from the really old work, like we've been looking at here, you started to see a little bit more distinction between them. But even then, it's difficult. So like a sort of classic Haida thing is a little easier to tell, and generally speaking, not all 100%, but generally speaking, Tsimshian and Haisla and Heiltsuk, all the mainland British Columbia northern groups, they tended to go toward really thin form lines, extremely thin form lines in some cases. But then so did some Haida artists, and not so much Tlingit artists. But and in a way, because a number of historic period, 19th century Tlingit artists tended to maintain some of the older characteristics, the broader form lines and use of circles in U-shapes and stuff like that. They tended to maintain some of those things. Then people see that work or anything like it, including older works, and immediately think, oh, that must be Tlingit. And a lot of things have been misidentified by, you know, museums and books and all that kind of stuff, because they presume that anything that's got broad form lines and old style must be Tlingit. But I think they're ignoring the reality that the old Haida work and old Tsimshian work also had those broad form lines, small carved out area characteristics. And the way you know that is that you can find, like I can think of a particular rattle that was in a private collection in New York that had a beautiful classic skull-like Tsimshian face on one side. I mean, there's no question it was Tsimshian. And on the back, if you just saw the back, most people who are even familiar with the art style would say, oh, that looks like Tlingit style because of heavier weight form lines and stuff like that. But it's obviously Tsimshian because it's all the same rattle, right? So, and there are a lot of other indicators, like there was that famous Dundas collection, they called it, from old Metlakatla that was acquired in 1863 and then went to England and stayed there ever since. It was auctioned a few years ago, and a lot of those things were purchased by Canadian collectors to bring it back to Canada. And there was an old caribou antler club in there, which is a distinctly Tsimshian type of thing. You don't see Haida versions of it, you don't see Tlingit versions of it. And it had this really beautiful, old, angular, classic, old-style form lines on it, and it's distinctly a Tsimshian object. So there's a lot of evidence that that was the case. They were much more the same in the distant past, but it's really difficult. It gets down to where you can pick out individual artists that are known to have been Haida, and in some cases even individual Tsimshian artists. And the Tlingit style is a little bit easier to pick out, but even then it's not always so simple. So I can't say, well, Haida flat design does this and this, and because it doesn't exist that way. And it's really hard. But nowadays it just comes down to individual artists. Although a lot of people working today, say among the Tsimshian, they maintain some of those conventions of the 19th century, the thinner form lines and all that kind of stuff. And we'll look at some examples of that too. So sorry I don't have a flat, tidy answer for that, but this because one doesn't exist. Yeah. Any other questions that people have? All right then. So what's the hardest part of a design for different people? The head, the body, the what?
Legs.
Legs and feet, how to cram them in there.
Body.
Body's a difficult one, yeah.
One side's harder than the other.
Yeah.
Usually the second side.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what computers are for. I was doing a design class one time, and we had enough time that I was working out a pretty detailed design, like a painted box, you know, a tall, narrow painted box. And I just set out to do half of it because there's no point in doing the other side on the chalkboard. And it would take too much time. The object of it was to show how to compose the half of the design, and the other half was just came with it. So I got it all done, and you know, some people were taking pictures of the drawing, and one of them ran off to a computer and it came back and flipped it over and showed me a picture of the whole thing spread out, and I was kind of amazed to see it because I didn't know really what it would look like. But it's nice to have tools like that sometimes. Anyway, what I think we could start with is if we continue a little bit with this kind of thing, and then we can branch into heads of different kinds of creatures, just to get a notion of how to deal with different parts. And then then we'll address the situation of bodies and what to do with that. And as far as that goes, even these kind of things that will work out like this, I think can be a big step toward solving that problem of what to do in the body and whatnot like that. Because somehow fins and tails and heads are more straightforward because we're used to seeing that more, and it's a little easier to work it out. But just about every design that you make has a different body shape. And so, wow, how do I deal with that? But the thing is, if we can get to where, by starting within the ovoid shape and then going to other kinds of shapes, if you can get to where you can confidently fill any space, even before you worry about what it is, like say if I just took a shape like this, say, and said, okay, let's fill that with Formline design. And you might think, well, when am I going to ever need that, you know? But the thing is, if you can get to where you can confidently distribute form lines throughout a shape like this or any other seemingly random shape, then in fact, when it comes time to do a wing shape design, you just fill that in. If it comes time to do a body, it's just another challenging shape, you know. So you get comfortable filling any shape, no matter what it is, with form lines, then you can fill any shape with form lines. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, if you're doing an animal, if you drew the outline, is that what you're speaking of? Draw the
Yeah,
outline
that's
of
it.
the body?
Well, right, that exactly, and that's anytime we do a design, and I can make a demonstration to show this. You're doing a little bit of both. On the one hand, if you use design forms alone, sort of consistent design forms to build a design step by step by step, you can reach your goal that way. Or you can start with an outline that you want to have, and maybe you can use that outline to put a dynamic into it that might not exist otherwise, or you might not be able to predict otherwise. And then you have the outline, and then you adapt your shapes to that, rather than having the outline be the result of assembling shapes. So it's sort of this 3 of one and half a six-pack of the other in a way, because you're doing a little bit of both all the time. So you're, on the one hand, you're adapting formline shapes and movements to particular forms, and at the same time you're building a design out of design parts. So it's always a little bit of both. And so by starting with something familiar and relatively easy to adapt to, like an ovoid shape, that's a start, and then you can go on from there to other less predicted shapes. And the ovoid works out nice because as the people who designed this, the old timers who came up with this way of looking at things, designed it, these shapes just naturally fit within an ovoid very straightforwardly, and that's why so many parts, sometimes heads, also bodies, start out as ovoid shapes to begin with, and then there's different ways of filling it. So we can do that to start with, but and then we'll get into stuff like this too. So what I want to do is do a couple of examples within ovoids like these, and maybe add in some more characteristics that we haven't dealt with, and then we'll have everybody draw their own ovoid and fill it in, and I'll come around and take a look at how it's all going. All right, so I'll leave this out for now. We'll come back to something like that. And the thing I'd like people to focus on is to, in your mind's eye, visualize a space, and then knowing the traditions of these design shapes, be able to adapt them to any kind of a form. So you'll look at the space, you'll put a design shape down, you'll look at the space around it, and using some of the principles that we talked about yesterday, like design movement and all that, and then you can use those things to help you eliminate less successful choices. Is what you're doing. So, like for instance, on here, and if we think back to that notion of the ovoid has these 4 directions that are sort of naturally emphasized by it, and the U-shapes have their own sense of flow, right, so that they describe. So if we look at this design, on the one hand, the placement of this ovoid sort of emphasizes this movement here because it's longer than it is tall. And so this U-shape is harmonizing with that. It's going this way. And that actually goes along with this ovoid that's also oriented this way. And a lot of times I find people try to fill a space or design a space, and they actually neglect to take that into account. And when you start sticking design shapes together at weird angles, not to say that that can't be done, but what that does, if you're working within a given shape, like a whale's body or a bird's body or whatever it is, you have to watch out that you're not creating difficult spaces to deal with. And when you put a design shape in place, you want to be all the other shapes to flow with it. So if you're careful about how you distribute those, it's easier to resolve into a successful design than if you stick things in a more random fashion. So keep this stuff in mind, because it makes a big difference in the end. So then what about the rest of this? Well, this big U shape is flowing this way, and yet that also harmonizes with that direction in this ovoid, see? So it's like starting here, and then this is a transitional space, and then the flow comes back this way, and then ultimately, because of this corner, back up to where you started. So it's all kind of moving in a harmonious way. And that's part of what this whole design system works under. It works best if it's in harmony with itself. And if you're trying to do disharmonic things, it makes it that much harder, actually. So let's draw, I want to avoid that spot, but I'll draw an ovoid right here. And when you put these on your paper, make sure you've got enough room to be able to put everything in there. And this time, and again, every one of these things I'm working on here, I'm going to start by putting inside edge of shapes. And that will usually mean starting with an ovoid, because again, it's the grandmother of designs, and that's where they're born from. So this time I'm going to put a round ovoid right up here in the corner, the inside edge of it. And again, make sure that that's placed so that the outside edge of the line that would naturally be around that has its own space. So it's not too far from the edge, it's not too far from the top. So that this is the thickest part up here on top, is thinner on the sides, and the thinnest on the bottom, all the typical things that we know about ovoid. I'm going to start with that. And then we don't have a straight bottom line to work with there, but I'm going to pretend we do. And I'm going to put it at a slight angle so it's rising up this way. And I'm going to bring that out and then drop it down like that, in kind of a beaky type shape. So I'm starting right on the outside edge of that same form line that I began with, and just coming off to the right and then drop down and turn as it meets the bottom corner. And in just about any, I find anyway, that in just about any design of an animal creature that I draw, I find that the two most important lines are the eye socket and the line of the mouth, because they determine where the directions and the pattern, the flow of everything else. So it's a sort of a logical place to start. In the case of this, or any related form of a head, whether it's a profile of a eagle or a profile of a bear, whatever it is, those two lines are going to be really significant. So now, we've got this ovoid here. We got 4 directions in it, even though it's a circle. And we're going to bring U shape out this way. It's a natural form, but I'm going to want to not make that one big U shape. Doesn't have to be. And after you've done a few hundred of them where it is one big U shape, it's kind of fun to do it different. So then I'm going to put another small roundish ovoid right over here. And I'm going to put a slightly flattened bottom on it. And I'll dot in the form line around it so that we know what that placement is. So the inside edge, I've put it slightly higher than this line, and it's kind of centered over the dip down this way. So again, I'm placing ovoids because the rest of the design flows in one direction or another out from them, see? They really function as, well, joints is a common use, right? So you think of a joint, well, then the joint's here, the arm goes this way, and et cetera, like that. So it makes sense to place them in strategic positions and then work the rest of the design around them. So if everybody's got that, I don't want to move too fast, but at the same time, I don't want to move too slow. So, and if you're used to the design style enough that you don't have to mark the outside edge of the ovoid, then don't feel like you have to. But I'm doing it just for people who are less used to that. And go ahead and dot that in like that if you think it will help you, and then it might, you never know. At least for now. So we know whenever we put one of these negative spaces, which it's the unpainted space that we're starting with. And again, I think that is beneficial because that, I think, was the origin of this kind of stuff to begin with, was negative spaces carved in to create designs, and then by conventionalizing the space around those carved out spaces, that suddenly, hey, we've got form line. Okay, so now we've got these two ovoids, and this one's got directions in it too. And we've got this natural sense of flow coming this way. So what I want to do is start the inside edge of a U shape up here on top. And I'm just going to come out like the leg of a U shape, and I'm going to turn it down right where the outside edge of that other ovoid would be. And then turn it back this way and end it like a U shape ordinarily would. So now we've got this space down below, we have this space up here, and we don't want to leave this as a solid black thing. We want more negative space cut out of here, and we probably want to respect the outside edge of that ovoid line there. So by just arcing across there without going, you notice it doesn't touch this other line and it doesn't touch the outside line. So that's the base of a negative space. And we could make that again either a crescent, a trigon, or a cycle. In this case, that's kind of a big area for a circle, and it would end up being so big it would sort of compete visually with this one, so we'll throw that one out. It could be a trigon and it could be a crescent. In fact, sometimes a crescent that might, on the one hand, just be two curved lines, can also come out, the farther out it comes, the more like a U shape you can make it, see? Even though it's still a negative space, a carved out space. So up here, I think it would be interesting to make a kind of a broad crescent that has really U-shaped characteristics. So that's the inside edge of a U-shape, the negative part of a unpainted part of a U-shape sitting there. And then above that, the outside edge of that would be up here. And again, we got the same choices. How are we going to mark the outside edge of that form line? Because if you don't mark the outside edge of the form line, you don't have form lines. So you don't have to do it every time in every place, but that's part of how the system works. So maybe that could be a small little trigon. Let's do that. We'll bring it up that way, and then like that. It could be anything else as well of the other choices, but we'll make it like that. Okay, so that is completed, at least the top part, into a formline structure. And then we've got this little beaky kind of area, so that if we mark the outside line, outside edge of that ovoid form line, let's just bring a kind of a sagging crescent down into that space. I got a little funny chalkboard spot right there, but a little narrower than the one above so that they don't look exactly the same. So one of them carries the upflow of the ovoid up and back to the eye socket. The other one carries the flow downward. And then this last corner of the ovoid here is small. We could get away with not having anything there. It's not that big of an area. But if you wanted, you could put either a crescent or a circle in there. It wouldn't fit that bad. So we can stick a little circle there. And then, of course, all those form lines will eventually get filled in. So I'll mark them just so it's not too confusing here, hopefully. What's painted and what isn't. So then, what we need, if this is an eye socket and an upper beak, what we need is the lower jaw, right? So that will be our next shape, and it's pretty straightforward. But there are different ways we could do it. So for this one, let's use what is actually the most common way of dealing with that, which we made an example of over here yesterday that I've erased. And that is that off the left side of the ovoid on the inner edge, we'll follow the outside of the whole big ovoid down, because that'll be a form line there. Come all the way down like that, and then it'll get a little narrower as it goes around the corner, and then come across parallel to the bottom, and then drop down where it meets the little beak extension thing there in the other corner. Something got sprayed on this chalkboard, and it's kind of weird. It makes some cases the chalk doesn't stick. I'm going to remember to fill in this beak here. Okay, so then that's a form line that comes all the way down from the eye socket and across the bottom. And as I mentioned, if you look through all the designs that are possible to find, and you look at all the elaborated inner ovoids like this, you'll see that probably 80 or 90% of the time, but quite often, they use this little structure. And so then the top side of the mouth line will come along, and that's what will turn down to the bottom line. Just turn it down right there. And usually that point is somewhere in the middle third or so of the eye socket. So if you divided an eye socket like this into thirds, somewhere in that middle space is where that would turn down. It can be in a different place in some examples, but I'm speaking of the most often seen. So then the back side of that, we'd take the inside edge of the ovoid eye socket there, and then follow that curve down and taper it out to a point at the bottom. And sometimes that point ends up being pretty wide. It's not really pointed at all, but in other cases it's really just tapered down to a point. So we can make it like that. And what that leaves is that 3 pointed corner and 1 rounded corner U-shaped area for a cheek design. And so in there, if it's an inner ovoid, it's likely to be the same color, black. If this is a head standing on its own, it's more likely to be the opposite color, red if black and black if red. So we'll hook a U-shape in there by touching it in the top two pointed corners. So that means, like we did yesterday, we'll come down a V-cut's width away from the main form line and come across in a U-shape and then back up and touch on the corner of the back of the jaw there, leaving that what is really a big trigon right there. A trigon that happens to have a rounded side on it and comes back this way and then comes down that way, but it's still a trigon. And in fact, if you look at really old work or even southern coast work, they might do a eagle's head and end up as simple as this: an eye, a simple eye, a slit for the mouth, a crescent coming forward from the eye, another crescent maybe, and then behind the mouth, at least a crescent or two or a trigon like this. And these will just, there's no real form line here per se. I mean, you can't extract any of these shapes out and say, oh, that's a form line, because there's no, there's nothing consistent about the space around these negative spaces, except maybe here, you could say that's a U shape, but it's not the same as this. And so this is a conventionalized, structuralized version of this. It grew from this very straightforward, simple technique of making cuts in a space to create the illusion of parts, eyes and mouths and so on. But the mouth is just a slit, this is just a trigon, these are two trigons and a couple of crescents. So that trigon behind the mouth, when you work it in, when you start really conventionalizing the positive space, you end up with that cheek design there. And I'm just going to mark this with parallel lines to indicate that it could be a different color. And it leaves the negative trigon surrounding it. And I kind of obscured the end of it a little bit, but there is the end of the trigon there. Okay, so now we've enclosed that whole ovoid with a Formline web, and then you just put in your eye, and in this case I'll just make a round eye floating up above the center, and inside that fine line, I just drew the fine line, right? And inside the fine line, I'll put the solid one. So there's the eye, and then we could put another inner ovoid out here, and I'll do the same thing, more or less round. Start with the fine line and then put the ovoid within it. And we could put a fine line U-shape in here, follow the outside edge of V-cut's width away, all the way around, and back into the corner. And then we'll put a trigon split in there. These other smaller crescents, because they're really negative spaces and transitional, we don't have to put anything in there, but we might at the very least just put a fine line across the bottom with a little crescent space between it and the form line to add that sense of detail that they do. And then down here, we'll treat that, even though it's only got one pointed corner and 3 rounded ones, we'll treat that like a U-shaped space that would be standing up this way. And the other one's going this way. So we'll use that notion and follow the outside edge of that with a fine line, what Holm would call a tertiary line. And then we'll put a trigon split beneath that that runs back and touches in each of the lower corners, even though this is a more rounded corner than not, but it still works. So here's another completely different version of a elaborated ovoid. So then what if we, let's jump from there. We could do more of those, but let's move on for a bit. And let's make I want to illustrate that contrast to what we were talking about based on what Jay brought up about do you make an outline or what? So what if we built an eagle's head sort of on those lines? If we start with I apologize for standing in front of what I'm doing, but I'll try to not as best I can. But if we start with a ovoid eye socket over here, and then we might put we have got the Formline around it, of course. And then say we want to put a beak out here, so we make a U shape come out this way, right from there, like you would expect. So there's the eye socket and the beak. So this, we got the ovoid there. This is a natural U-shaped kind of thing. You just bend the corner over for the point of the beak. And then if we make the mouth parallel to the bottom of the eye socket like it should be, and then turn back for the lower jaw, and then bring the head down into the corner of the jaw and out, and maybe taper it up out here. And even if we just make that kind of a corner, then we'll fill in the U shape here in the front. And we'll put the inside edge of it so that the outside edge of the U shape and the form itself has the right proportions, thickest on the end and thinner on each side. And then we'll put let's just put a crescent here on the outside edge of that U shape to separate it from the little triangle that becomes the tip of the beak. So I'll just quickly fill that in so it's easier to see. And that you know, it's just the most basic form for, say, an eagle's head. But then let's contrast that with the notion of starting with an outline. I'm deliberately making these a certain way to emphasize the point, but then what if we, well, that'll be fine for now. Then what if we do something, this ends up being very ovoid shaped, right? And because the eye socket is parallel to the lower jaw, it makes the mouth just kind of straight out, almost parallel on each side. So what if we want something a little more expressive, say, in our eagle's head, and we do something that's got more, we're not going to worry about the ovoid shape. We're going to make the eagle's head shaped how we want it to be shaped. So what if we do something along these lines and maybe close to it? So I'll have the beak arc up this way and curve around more like that. And then we'll have the back of the head come around like this and then come down and then maybe taper up and in like that. So now I'm starting with the outline. And I'm not here the outline was the result of placing these shapes, more or less. And here I'm going to make the outline and adapt these same shapes. I'm going to use the same structure, but I'm going to fit it into this space instead of that space. So there, I didn't have the space to start with. The design shapes determine the space, the shape. And here I'm starting with the shape. So now I will admit that when I started this, I knew what the shape was going to come out like because, well, you got an ovoid and a U shape. It's going to be ovoid shape. That's not too repetitive. But anyway, so to make this work, then, I can't put the ovoid right parallel to the bottom like this, can I? Because then the line around it wouldn't match the upward curve of the eagle's head. Can everybody see this okay, even in the back? It's not too low? Okay. So that means when we put the eye socket in there, and I'll use a similar ovoid eye socket, it means we're going to have to tip the eye socket pretty radically so that the top arc of the eye socket ovoid, I still want to come out sort of symmetrical, but the top arc of the eye socket ovoid has to follow the upward curve. So now we'll put the outside edge of that so that we know where it's at. And it's no longer parallel to the bottom jaw, it's at an angle. And I'll fill in at least part of that form line around that, which would come up like this, and down here. But you see what I'm getting at is that the upper curve, you have to place that inside edge of that ovoid so that the upper curve of it matches the upper curve of this space. Otherwise, this area would extend way back here over the top of the ovoid, and you might be able to make that work, but it might be kind of a little bit weird. And we're trying to reach toward a more dynamic expression, like the eagle's making some noise or something, rather than a more static thing of parallel lines. Because that's another principle that is built into many design structures, and you can especially see it on chests and boxes, but it exists in other kinds of things too that are less conventional than that. And that principle is you could put in one scientific sounding word, is non-parallelism. And what that means is that if you're looking at let me just find a spot to make a quick illustration. Or two. I'll make two sort of basic square box type, taller than they are wide shapes. And you could have the eye sockets like this, and the mouth like this, and then the other ovoids down here like this, and the body like this, and what's going on up here, ovoids up here like this. That would be one way. But another artist might tip the eye sockets a lot more like this, and the area above it might tip more. And then rather than the mouth being flat, we'll see examples where the mouth arches way across like this, and the upper side of the mouth has more arc in it like this, and the lower ovoids, instead of being parallel to the bottom, might tip radically either up this way or even down this way. And what I mean by that is, the whole ovoid is tipped like that. Same with over here. And so you end up with, if you're just drawing a straight line through each ovoid, you might end up with something that's more like this, and then the body over here like so, and there might be something else in here, another design complex at doing that. Whoops. So here, there's a series of non-parallel lines, and because they're sort of increasing in angle as they go up, and at the same time, inner ovoids and that kind of thing are floating upward toward the top rather than sitting in the middle, then you look at the design and it all appears to be like rising like steam, as opposed to a design that's sitting there flat and square like this. And you'll notice that's, again, it's a principle. Some artists use it not very much, and some artists really exaggerate it. So it just depends. It's there to be used if people are aware of it, see? So if you always make the eye socket parallel to the lower jaw, then the mouth always looks straight, and even if it's wide open, it looks like it's a closed mouth. But if you tilt the eye socket at a different angle than the lower jaw, it looks like the mouth is open and it's much more dynamic. But that's not to say one's 100% better than the other, they're just different. And some people feel like, well, you know, I want to follow this tradition and do it this way and do it that way. But if you actually look at the whole tradition, you'll find that there are exceptions, and artists in different places and different times really took advantage of and exaggerated some of these principles, like the non-concentric thing or this non-parallel line thing, and others that are there to be used. And some of the artists in any group would use those, and we'll see some examples as well. Okay, so now we've got, if we take the U shape for the beak out parallel to the bottom of the eye socket, now it's coming up at this angle. And if we curve it down to the point of the beak the same way we did there, it would curve, arc down like that, and end down there at the point. And again, this is why I'm suggesting that the eye socket and the line of the mouth, the upper side of the mouth, are the two most important lines in a design, because especially if you don't start with the outline and you're just starting with these negative spaces, as soon as you make the inner edge of the eye socket, you establish that, the length, the height, the angle of it, and the mouth line is essentially an extension of that. Once you establish that, you've established the length, even without this outline here. You've already established the length of the beak because you've shortened it to this point right here. And where you put the bottom jaw is wide open at that point, but it still has to relate to these other two lines. So I think those are the two most important lines, and the ones I always like to start with. So then, if we're going to use the same structure, we'll bring the inside edge of a U shape out into this space, and we might kind of follow the arc of the line of the outline a little bit. Then we'll bring the inside edge of that U shape up so that it's a normal U shape, and the space around it, the all-important space around it, the form line itself, the corner of it would be right there. So that would then fill in like this. And the eye socket ovoid would fill in at least that far back. Now, you could say, well, the end of the U shape is this wide and the side of it's almost as wide. Well, that's the way it goes, because the inside edge of the U shape is consistent, and in this case the outside edge is being adapted to a certain extent to match this larger arc that we decided to put in there. So rather than, I didn't want to follow that exactly and have the U shape be an odd shape, and I didn't want that to become too thin, so I'm just going to let the outside shape of the U form, the form line itself, adapt. It's going to be the one that's going to give in a little bit, but the consistency of the system is there in the form of the inside edge of the U-shape. So then we used a crescent here at the beak, and we could do that again. We'll maybe make it a little bit more of a sagging crescent instead of a conservative one. So we got that part, and then we'll build the bottom jaw in the same structure. We won't change that. So that means I'm going to come back along the bottom of the eye socket and then turn around, go the other direction, and pick up the line of the lower jaw, sort of like that, because I want it to. I made this little up here so that the beak would taper down as it reached the front. And then we've got the crescent at the back of the mouth, corner of the ovoid, like the other structure, because we're decided I'm going to use the same structure. So we'll open up that crescent there and then fill in the lower jaw. So here, this is an example then of two identical structures as far as the form lines go, but a very different look to each of the two eagle's heads. And when you think about, an eagle with its beak open and the lines of it and all that, this one has a little bit more dynamic form than this, and that's okay. That could be a good thing. And then you'd put, we could end up with the same secondary structures if we wanted to do that. We'll follow the inside edge of the mouth around with a fine line, and then we might put like the end of a U shape back here so that we get a little other color in there, and then a split in the space that's left, in the middle of the space that's left. I'll get out of the way. So that we've got this fine line becomes the end of a U shape here and then comes back forward. Sorry about that little wobble in the line there. I know it's hard enough to see all these separate lines from the back there. I'll have that there. And then the split comes up there. And then I would do the same thing here, but it'll end up looking a little bit different. So even without filling in these other spaces, we can see that you're always doing a little bit of both. You're putting down formline shapes, or you're envisioning formline shapes, and you're also creating a silhouette, creating outlines, and adapting shapes to that outline. Because these forms and this whole tradition is really flexible once you get used to it, and you can see examples of how people use that flexibility. And it's able to do these things without changing it at all, as far as structures and that go. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's do that. Let's go on from there. And we can do a little bit of each. We can start with an outline in some cases, and we can build from the inside out in other cases. Well, for this one, let's just start with an eye socket, and let's put it at a slight tilt, and let's make it kind of longer, wider, that is to say, than it is tall. We're just going to start with the inside edge of the eye socket, Formline. And then, starting in about the center of that bottom line of the ovoid, we'll go parallel to it, like this, and extend that line, which is the bottom edge, the outside edge of the ovoid eye socket. We'll extend that out and curve it down a little bit, and then a little dip drop, not very far, at the end. So that there's about as much space out in front of the eye socket as there is in the eye socket itself. So we end up with sort of similar proportions. Not that it matters a lot, but. So we got these two lines. And so, again, this tells us almost everything about this raven's head. We know that the back of it is going to be right here, the outside edge of that form line. And we know that the end of it is going to be about here, because that's where the tip of the beak just barely turns down. And the height of it is fairly well established, because we know the top of the head will be at the outside edge of this eye socket form line, and depending on how wide the mouth is it will be the last determining factor to how tall the head is. But most of it's already all established just by those two lines. So that's why I think those are so important.
What about the ear? Would you add that after?
Yeah, we're going to add that after. And you know, that is another unknown. It could be tall, it could be narrow, it could be wide and low, it could be different ways. But the essence of the head is already all there. So we know from looking at ravens walking around here that if we follow the top line of the outside of the eye socket form line, we know that a raven's beak doesn't drop down very far from the top of the head, but maybe a little bit if we want to be naturalistic about it. And then it comes out sort of like that. It could be a little narrower out here and probably wouldn't wait, but it wouldn't have to be. I'm going to make it a tad narrower. That's what comes from trying to do it from off at the side. I'll just drop that a wee bit faster so that it's not quite so broad at the end. And then let's turn the mouth around in the sort of the middle of the eye socket. So we'll take that line and reverse it, but we're not going to go parallel to the other one. Let's drop it down this way, because we're not worried about staying in an ovoid shape, as if the mouth is wide open like this bird is squawking already. So then we can go ahead and firm up the form line around the top of the eye socket. And even the front corner. And then maybe the next spot we'll look at is the beak itself, since it's staring us in the face. I lost my spontaneous beak line there, so I'm trying to get back to it anyway. Now, here we start having choices. That could be one big U shape, and there's nothing wrong with that. But after the 200th time you've made it one big U shape, you might decide, well, let's make it a little different. So let's put a small ovoid inside edge right out here near the end, but not right at it. Like that. And remember, place it so that the outside edge of the form line around it will extend from the top of the beak at that point all the way to the bottom. And again, we're starting with the inside edge because we're working with an indelible paintbrush, and we don't want to have to erase any of these painted lines, because every line we're putting down here could be a painted line, because we're not going back, except when I make a boo-boo, we're not going back and changing them. And in fact, there's a real, as an aside, there's a real interesting book out that was put together at the University of British Columbia Museum. I'll write the name here, The Transforming Image. And the authors' names are McLennan and Duffick. A-N, I think, and Duffick is how she pronounces it, Karen Duffick.
And this is where they used that infrared.
Yeah, right.
Because I was up there when they were working on it.
Oh yeah, they've been working on it for 30 years,
Yeah.
almost.
When they were getting the pictures up on the wall.
Yeah, they've done some small exhibits at UBC with some of those images over time. Yeah, as they were putting the book together. So this came out in, I think, 2000, so it's a 10-year, 11-year-old book now. But it's really significant because, as Jay was saying, this guy, Bill McLennan, at UBC, he's not the first and only person to have used infrared photography for what it can reveal, but he really explored it in this little world of Northwest Coast flat design. So they went around, they got some grants, and they started on the UBC collection, and they were photographing flat painted subjects, boxes, chests, house fronts, box drums, anything the techniques don't work very well for something that's sculptural, even if it's got a flat design on it. If it's got any dimension to it, the infrared rays don't bounce directly off it, and so you don't get the advantage. But what happens is, if you take they were particularly looking at boxes and chests that were really dark and faded and worn sometimes. And there was they had just like 1 or 2 boards of an old house front painting, and it was really worn and weathered. And if you took a picture of it straight out with the color or black and white film, you couldn't really see it very well. And what happens with infrared black and white film is that you shine a light on it and the film becomes sensitive to the heat, infrared heat. And so they found, it had been found, and they were taking advantage of it, that the painted areas reflected more of the infrared light than the unpainted areas. So, I'm sorry I don't have it here to show you because it looks greater in eyes than it is to describe it. But take a picture of the infrared film of the same thing, and suddenly you can see all the painted lines, the little fine lines and all that were worn almost to non-existence in the first one. Any little flecks of paint that are in there, you'll pick up that heat and sort of emphasize it. And suddenly you could really clearly see these old painted designs that were hidden behind this curtain of age, see? And in some cases it's a really spectacular revelation. In others, well, you could pretty well see it anyway, but it made it much more clear. And then they could print those on, clear mylar, print it out, and then they had guys that were working with the museum, native artists from the different areas that the objects originated in, who then would use that mylar and copy the design exactly on a new piece of wood and recreate the entire image, where before you could only see parts of it. So it's a real interesting book. It's thick, and it's easy to say hundreds, and there might be thousands. I never counted them all. But there's a whole lot of pictures of boxes and chests and stuff like that. And they did a great chapter on paints and pigments, what kind of pigments were used long ago, what some of the sources of those, when trade pigments came in, what they looked like, and they infraresce. Anyway, they look different. Those different colors of red, for example, look different in the infrared depending on what they're made of, whether it's red ochre, traditional, or vermilion trade pigment, or another trade pigment called red lead. They all show up different on the infrared film. And it's a great chapter on the painter's art and paintbrushes and the whole schmear, the medium, the salmon eggs, and all that. And although I have to say it's not without its flaws, this book. So when you look at the dates of the object, they assigned approximate dates to some of these things. And I think that they really needed to study that a little harder, because the dates are really misleading. I think a lot of them are absolutely wrong. They say some things are way old that I don't think are anywhere near that old. And some things that are incorrectly placed. And the other mistake they made was in assigning tribal associations to unknown objects. And they fell for a common error that when objects end up in museums, they record where they got it. And they might have got this nice chest, nice Haida chest, looks Haida style in general, from a Vancouver Island village, of which there's a lot of them that were down there. They came down by marriage and other kinds of things. People came from way up north here, all the way down to Victoria in the mid-19th century, from 1837 or whenever Fort Victoria was established, right on up into the 1860s, and then the big smallpox epidemic spread right from Victoria. Miners from San Francisco came up to go to the Fraser River gold fields, brought smallpox with them, and it spread throughout the population in Victoria, despite all the immunizations and stuff that were going on. And then people fled Victoria and brought it all back up here, and everybody knows that story. So along the way, some stuff got left behind, or canoes were abandoned with all the gear in them, and so things ended up spread all over. So they made the mistake of identifying things as where they came from instead of where they originated. So they took several inner ovoids, like we were drawing, out of painted chests that were all collected on Vancouver Island villages, but they're not made from there. They're northern style work. And they said these are examples of Kwakwaka'wakw style, Vancouver Island style, but they're not. They just slipped up. So don't trust everything that's in there. Ignore the dating and kind of take with a grain of salt tribal identifications, because a lot of them are wrong. But
Hey Steve,
yeah,
that book's available to anybody who wants to look at it up at the Sealaska Heritage's library, so
there you go.
if you guys don't have
Yeah.
access to it anywhere else.
There's a great amount of information in it. And the other little minor error that they made was that what I mentioned before, where anything that's got heavyweight old style form lines they identify as Tlingit. And probably they're not all Tlingit. Some of them are old Haida style, some of them might be old Tsimshian style, but they didn't leave that option available. They just, whoosh, they're all Tlingit, which is okay. It's good for the Tlinkits, it's nice stuff. But they may or may not be there. Okay, back to the Raven. But it's a tremendous amount of effort and great. And one of the
On the other hand, like Wilson Duff over-attributed the Eden Shaws,
Right.
everything that was painted well was an Eden Shaw.
right, yeah, he got
So
right.
it goes both ways.
Yeah, he got carried away with that as well. Yeah, and a lot as the whole Edenshaw study thing has changed a lot, because they realized that there were people like John Robson, who was a contemporary of his and had a lot of things that they're now recognized as John Robson's work were at one time attributed to Edenshaw and so on. But anyway, let's look at this. And so now we've got this space between the eye socket and this little ovoid. To the right of it is going to be pretty straightforward. If we follow the outside edge of the form line there and open up a little crescent there, that'll take care of the shape of the beak at the end. But what do we want to do in here? So anytime you got a space like this, all right, we've decided we're going to put this kind of nostriloid ovoid over here. Well, what are we going to do in here? So a U shape is the natural choice. And there's 4 pointed corners right here at the moment. So meaning we could put a U shape running in any one of these 4 directions, because we've got 2 pointed corners on each face of that to anchor a U shape. But some of them are going to work better than others. But let's try them all just so that we can see the range of choices. So if we decided to run a U shape up and down, we'd start along the outside edge of the eye socket form line and swing our U shape up and then down over like this. And that wouldn't be that bad, so let's look at that. And then the outside edge of it is partly overlapped by the eye socket and partly overlapped by that, and we could use a little ligature across the bottom. That wouldn't look that bad, because we could have a little trigon here that would follow these lines, right? We could put a crescent over here so it wasn't the same, and a little ligature across the bottom. And that would complete that, and that's reasonably successful. It's going this way, and all these other 2 ovoids have that, so it's harmonizing with that sense of direction, see? So that's one possibility. Let's erase those and come up with another one. So what if it was the exact opposite? What if it was going down instead of up? So I'll keep the dotted line of the nostril. So if we start up at the top, swing our U shape down from the eye socket form line and back up to the nostriloid form line. So the U-shape's running that way. Then that's going to make a much longer ligature across here. Well, that's still okay. Not that bad. And we could put a crescent on this side, and maybe we'd use a trigon over here so that they're not the same. And that would work, although somehow it makes it look like there's a big whack in the top of the raven's beak, right? Doesn't look quite right. Even though there's this form line here, this going this way and the other two going that way, it just doesn't seem to fit quite as good. So let's toss that one. The other one was, the first one was okay, but I'm not as wild about this solution. So we'll go to a different one. These, of course, these little choices and options a person would complete in your mind's eye in an instant, right, with our computer minds, but we'll draw them here individually just to see the process. So the most predictable one would be to run the U-shape this way, right? So we'll do that one last. And instead, let's look about, well, what if we went the opposite way? There's another fourth choice here. If we start here on the outside edge of the nostril one and we come this way and swing our U-shape down here, say, we're going to take advantage of the overlap in each case. Then it would be running like that. We'd put a crescent here and maybe a trigon up on the top side. And it would look like that. So that's doable as well. But again, it's maybe not as overall successful. And partly it's because we're ignoring the harmonic principle in this case. These are really this way, the beak is really running, I mean, it's part of the left and right orientation, but for some reason it just doesn't seem to be as successful. So let's toss that one also, and we'll go back to the most predictable one. It's not the only good one. I like the first one we did better than I thought I would, actually. But, so we'll start from the eye socket, swing the U-shape out, touch the outside edge of the nostril ovoid and back. Running it that way. So now this big ovoid complex out here with the black inner ovoid and everything is really part of the end of the U-shape, where when we ran it this way, the end of the U-shape wasn't as well satisfied by this one narrow line. It sort of looked like it'd been crimped out. And then the legs of the U-shape sticking forward, to me, didn't seem as visually pleasing as the legs of the U-shape running that way. So this is, on the one hand, the most predictable, not the only, but maybe in this case, one of the two best, at least, options for how to work that U-shape. And then we'll put let's try a crescent down here and a trigon up here. This could be a circle, or that could be a circle, either one, or reversed, but let's try it that way. So we'll go ahead and fill in the nostril ovoid and the legs of the U-shape in this form. But I wanted to walk through that little set of choices so that you can see the kinds of options that are available. Because we're still just talking about the main web of Formline. So then we got that sort of squared away. Let's look at the lower jaw and stuff over here. So if we come down the back of the eye socket like we know the tradition would, and we make a ovoid-like corner down here on the bottom, and that comes in a little too far. I'm going to move that line out. Oh, I just remembered why I started talking about the transforming image. Because in that, when they use that infrared film, especially in something that's worn, when something wears, the thinner parts of the paint, of course, wear off the quickest, and where the paint is thicker, it remains the longest, right? So when you can actually see in there, you can see how they would start a form line by painting the edge of it. You can't tell, there's no indication of which edge came first, but you can see they painted around the edge with a little thicker paint and around the opposite edge with a little thicker paint, and then they thinned it out a little bit to fill it all in, see? And when you're done, it all looks the same to the naked eye, but after it's worn, and then they photograph it with this really precise infrared film, you can see those individual lines to start with. And in some cases, you can see little things like this, where they painted a line and decided to change it. And just like I did here, there's 2 lines visible. I moved the other line out a little farther because it seemed to satisfy that ovoid shape a little better. And you can see that kind of stuff in some of these infrared photographs. It's really interesting. You can say, oh, okay, they made this wider over here. They dropped this line over here, all in the composition process. Because they didn't start with a finished design and cut it out on paper or something and transfer it to the box. They painted it right on the box. And so these little revisions show up, interestingly. And one of the sort of sad things about the march of technology is that Kodak doesn't even make that film anymore. So if they didn't do that when they did it, it wouldn't have been done. They didn't even bother to make that film. It's all digital now. God bless the digital age. Okay, so then let's put a little dynamic form in the bottom jaw, like that. If you look at a raven's skull, for example, and I'm going to make another little revision there. The structure of the skull and where the actual beak attaches and all that, you actually can see a form something like this in the skull. So they don't always have to be parallel lines, is what I'm getting at, these lower jaws. You can put some shape in them. So now we've got the basics of the head there. We need to resolve our form line situation over here. And what let's do this time, we've done examples of the most common structure over here, right? And that would be to have this line come down this way to there. And then this would turn down this way to there. And we'd put the little cheek design in the remaining space. That's the most common structure, but it's not the only one. So because we've already done that 850 times, we want to try something different. Let's just take this form line at the bottom of the eye socket, and we'll just turn it around right there and back. It's a little wobbly, but that's the idea. So then that's sort of completed, so I can fill this part in. I mean, they were making those pictures and stuff right up into the mid-90s, and then bam, no more film. They got it right at the end. They've been making that film for 100 years and quit right when they're finished. They're not even really finished. I mean, they could still be doing that. You can't buy the bloody film anymore. Okay, so it goes. Now, we got options again. So here we got 2 pointed corners. This one isn't really established, 1 rounded corner. We could have a U-shape coming down this way. I mean, that's essentially what the little cheek design thing is a U-shape coming down this way. We could have a U-shape coming back this way. We got the whole line of the mouth sort of going in that direction. We could have, it would be awkward, we couldn't really make a U shape go from left to right because these are rounded corners and this is pointed corners. It would be all backwards. And coming up from the bottom, well, let's look what that would look like. Let's try it. I don't think I would be happy with it, but let's take a look at why that might be the case. So if we took a U shape and ran it up this way and down, well, what's the problem with that? Well, even if we left a top on it so that there was something there, like that, and we put a ligature across the bottom here, it sort of breaks up that space instead of harmonizing with it. You see what I'm saying? So let's throw that choice out. We don't like that one. But the idea of continuing this line as it comes kind of powerfully tapering down, since the U-shape tapers anyway, if we put the points of the U-shape up here on the back of the jaw and run that form back here, even part way, it could go all the way back, but what if we end it right there? And the outside edge of that U-shape would be anywhere in this range right here. Now that harmonizes with the rest of the design much more harmonically, much more better than the other choices. And that's sort of a straightforward thing here. I mean, it's not all that mysterious or brilliant, but there are other situations where you're creating a design and sometimes you see U-shapes put in a design where the legs are sticking out and they're not attached to anything. And that's kind of weird. And if you think about it in terms of these harmonic principles and stuff, you would never do that. And you don't see it in the old work because they didn't do that. So part of the reason they didn't was because of this overriding principle of harmonic structure, harmonizing structure. At least that's one way to look at it. So now, because we didn't run the U-shape all the way to the end, it means we've still got space down here to deal with. And we could work off the outside edge of the U-shaped form line, or we could cut into it. And just it might be kind of fun to balance an ovoid here with another ovoid down here, even if it's just a negative ovoid without an inner ovoid, negative space. So let's take a small sideways ovoid with the bottom of it parallel to the end of the U-shape there, and we'll just stick it right there like that. And now it is also running harmonically in terms of its up and down orientation with this other line, so it automatically fits and works. And then we'd follow the outside edge of that, which would put it coming right down to the corner of the jaw, and then that leaves just this other little narrow spot there. I've made a problem for myself because if that was a painted line and I couldn't move it, I'd have to adjust this to fit within that. Instead, I can erase it right here because it's chalk, not paint. But otherwise, I would have had to take that into account, which is possible, but it's easier to erase it. So then at the end of that, we could take this form line coming around the eye socket and taper it down to nothing right there. And all we have to do then, we wouldn't leave it like that because this is all unpainted space right here right now, except for that one fine line. We wouldn't want to leave it like that. We want to enclose the thing in primary form line. So we would just use that little ligature notion of a swelling form line that tapers on each end, and that creates a little trigon right there. And then at the corners of this ovoid, if we wanted, and we had enough room to do it, we could put, say, circles at those junctures. And I'll get out of the way here in a second. So these, we could have ignored those junctures. We could have put little crescents there. We could put circles like this, but they're all just possibilities. So as far as that goes, we've now completed the Formline's web structure of the raven's head. If we want to put an ear on here, representing those little feathers that they can raise up on the back of their head, we could just have a U shape coming up like that, or a pretty straightforward stock U shape, or we could use the outline principle and say, okay, let's make an outline and we'll adapt our form line to it. So what if we made, we've got this kind of wide open dynamic going on over here. What if we had the ear come up like this and then arc around a little bit more and then maybe hook around and come down like that? I don't know if you'd really want to, but there's nothing to say you couldn't. And then we'll adapt our form line to that form instead of using the stock one right off the shelf, see? So then we'd put the inside edge of that, come up like so, and it would be the more conventionalized form, see? But the rest of the U shape going over the ear has a little different shape to it. And then we could follow the outside edge of that U shape, which would bring it down like that, right? And we could put a crescent along there and open that out towards the point of the ear, like that. So I'm just trying to illustrate as many different kinds of possibilities as we can think up here. So then, 2:30 already. So then if we, we could put in our other completing parts. There'd be we'd put an inner ovoid here. Start with the fine line, put the inner ovoid in it. And how much it floats up and how much it floats up within the fine line is artist preference. It also has something to do with changes through time, because in the same two ovoids in different time periods, some people, at least certain influential artists, made different choices. So if this was a negative ovoid space in an 18th century work, or one that was influenced heavily by 18th century work, you might have a, boy, that's slick right there, it's really weird. So this would be the inner ovoid, and the fine line around it, and this would be a form line out here somewhere. But that means that the carved out area is relatively small, see? And the painted positive area is pretty big. But by the middle 19th century, that's only a couple of generations from the 18th, the same inner ovoid might only be this big.
That's due to the iron in it. Iron and steel.
Well, I think that probably had a part to play, yeah, because with nice, graceful cricket knives, large hollow areas like that weren't a big deal, and long before that, I mean, centuries before that, it was a much bigger deal to carve anything out, and so it takes time to let the freedom of a new tool technology loosen up the design, and it wasn't just inner ovoids, but everything. So Formlines were thinner spaces. That means the inside space is getting bigger, because if this Formline is thinner, you'd move this line up to here and this one out to here and that one up even there. So even though the head might be the same size, the thinner Formlines, the negative space is then consequently larger all the way through here, 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 and everywhere else. And so that meant, oh, we got more space here. We can put more Formlines in them. And that's where you get this, you go from the simple, plain, solid cheek designs that we saw in those really old chests to ones where it's all Formlined up, even just in the little cheek design area. And so on like that. Every area became much more elaborated. But anyway, in terms of inner ovoids, that's how it would show up. So we could put our eye in here. Let's make it a fairly large eye, but we'll still float it up from the bottom slightly. And so what I like to do is start, close up here to the top, and then make one side how I want it so that I got room for my eyelid line. And then I'll just measure quickly from here to here, so that, I'm a little close, but not quite, aren't I? So that it comes out the same distance left and right. I mean, that's the idea anyway. My original measuring line was closer and I didn't go all the way to it. So that helped just to help you place that in the center left and right, as that is another common principle. And then we'll put in our eyelid line by following the inner ovoid and then dropping down to the lower third of the eye itself, and then bring the bottom of the eyelid line in, drop down around the bottom of the eye, and then back up. That's sort of crooked, but I need to raise this end. A little closer? I can't tell. Yeah, a little closer. But now what do we got going on here? We've got our heaviest line is up here. That means that this doesn't want to be wider than that solid black, so it means we need to put something in here to relieve that space. So without getting too carried away, we'll just make a ovoid shaped relief. So I'll make a negative ovoid in that space so that we're creating a Formline like that just goes around the outside of that eye. But we don't want to leave it empty like that exactly. It's a little big for that. If it was just a slit, like the simple one, that'd be fine. But we're going to open it up a little bit more. And then we put another positive ovoid inside of that. And that creates that ovoid shaped relief in there. And that breaks the solid black up into small enough sections that it doesn't look heavy and black in relation to the Formlines around it. So we've been doing fine lines and splits in these U-shapes, but another possibility is to put a mask-like face in there. We don't have to use Formlines, let's use a mask-like face. So we'll make a little circle for a nostril opening and a little spiral that goes around that, and then a lip line that comes back. So that's just like an upper lip and that goes around a little nostril hole. Like a sculptural thing made flat, and that's why I like to call it a mask-like face. And then we'll put an eyebrow up above that. So we'll put an arc in the eyebrow and bring it down, and then up and something like that. Different shapes the eyebrow could have. And then we'll stick a round eye in that eye socket and an eyelid around it. And if we wanted to, we could use a fine line off the top of the lip to create the back edge of the eye socket. So we just follow that line back and then curl it around in an ovoid type shape to meet the eyebrow. I'm talking about this little line right here. So it's like the back of an ovoid shaped eye socket. And then in this case, well, let's not worry about this little cheek area. And down here, we'll just put a simple row of teeth, coming down, turning back, and a couple of lines to represent spaces between teeth. So now we just stuck a little mask-like face in there. Now, this U shape down here is a little small for that, so we'll just use the predictable fine line split in there. And up here, let's make a negative U shape around the outside edge. So that means we'll run a fine line a U shape's width away from the form line. Like that. See, so this is a fine line here. And this space here will be hollowed out and painted blue. That's what Bill Holm would call a tertiary space. And then inside of that, we'll put two little solid U shapes, and I'm going to use square corners on the inside and round corners on the outside, like we saw some of that old work, and a crescent line for the base of it. And now we've got two secondary U shapes and a tertiary U shape around them. If you got enough space on your paper. If you made it too small, then it's okay. So I'll dash those like another color here. And except for this red lip and nose on the mask-like face, that's the only two red things on this, so it might be enough to balance it out. Or we could actually create a little bit of red space down here. You could use a red, we could make that split solid red around it. But if you actually look analytically at a lot of old work, you'll find that they don't use that solid red split hue very much at all. It's really rare in the old work. It's really common in contemporary work. So usually they were solid red U-shapes or splits, tertiary U-shapes.
Contemporary is in 20th century, maybe 50s after or something like that?
Yeah. By contemporary, that's what I'm referring to, is yeah,
Yeah.
since 1960 or so. So red split U's are really common now, but they weren't common 150 years ago. But we could make this into a solid red U shape in order to get more red into the whole thing to balance those other two areas. So we could change our little tertiary split U into a solid secondary one. And then we got here, here, and here, so there's more of a balance of that color in the whole design. So that's a possibility. Now, what if we want to have, well,
By the time
Oh, yeah, yeah. We needed something in the mouth, don't we? Okay, so what if we put a inside edge of an ovoid right smack on the lower jaw? We got our little ovoid-shaped bubble, see? And we can stick it anywhere, but let's sink it right, so it's actually right on the lower jaw, and there's a Formline width of space above it. So that the Formline around that would come to within a V-cut of the upper jaw, and surround that space on each side. So now what that does, it takes this big long mouth and divides it in half, sort of. We've got the space behind the ovoid and the space in front of it. So the space behind it, we can bring this is all secondary red stuff, so we can bring a U shape back into the end of the mouth and then have it taper out right where it meets the ovoid Formline here. And then that would mean we can mark that edge of the ovoid Formline and shade that in. And we can make that a skinny leg U shape coming back and then widen up the end of it. Like that. And then we can put that fine line split within it to make a tertiary. That creates, this would be hollowed out here and painted blue-green. So that's what Holm would call a tertiary area. And then if we take from the outside top of the ovoid Formline and we parallel the upper jaw out this way, it's a little strange because that's an open-ended space there. But what we could do, there's nowhere to anchor out here, in other words. So we'll just follow the upper jaw of V-cut's width away, all the way out, and then we'll just drop that line a little bit. We could actually just kind of touch it on the end of the beak. That'd be one way to take care of that. And then this is intended to be a line, V-cut's width line of even width all the way across the top there. And then, so this is one edge of a Formline. We can make the other edge by staying in the fine line mode for a little ways and then gradually opening that up a little bit, and then like the leg of a U shape, come down around the ovoid and follow that line back in, down to here, see? So we brought it back to the outside edge of that ovoid that we first put there, and then dropped down to become the outside edge of the ovoid. So then we can put a crescent along that juncture. We can open it up quite a bit so there's a lot of space in it. And that creates a kind of a, I forgot that this is red here, but I'll shade it as if it was red. And that creates this little Formline tongue thing going on. And if we wanted to deal with this space in some way, it's getting a little iffy now, but let's see what would happen if we ran a little split up like that. Well, that's kind of weird. I'm not sure I like that. Let's leave that alone. So if we wanted to kind of match the top, we could just run a fine line from the very tip of the lower beak parallel to it and bring it all the way back and just touch it to the bottom of the ovoid that we have right here. And then this would need an inner ovoid. And if we wanted to get cheeky, we could make a small inner ovoid with an eyelid around it. So that we got a little spirit eye in the mouth. So now the sort of the purpose of all this kind of a walk-through process is if this was drawn up here in this finished condition, and I asked each of you to copy this design, in a complete form, copy this design, where would you start? Unless you're already used to it, you'd know where you would personally start. But where do you start, and where do you finish, and how do you make it all work out? Well, if you did it in the same process that we just used, then you'd come probably closer to having it come out the same as if you just like started up here and start filling in stuff. But it gives you a way of controlling the proportions and the movements and all that stuff if you build it in a progressive formline way. So if this was going to be a standing raven, and we wanted like a backbone line to come down like that, you might have a wing hanging off back here doing something. Let's not worry about the wing too much. And we might have a tail down here with there could be an ovoid here and tail feathers coming down. The tails are more straightforward. Let's not worry about that. But then what do we do about a body and a foot kind of thing? Let's just set that up for ourselves and see what we can do with that. I'm going to make the tail a little bigger to make my job a little easier. But we're going to try to get into the less predictable part of the design, see? That's a little too big. I'm going to come back on it. Okay. What I like to do in a situation like this is use what I for myself, I just refer to as layout lines. So I did one up here that suggests that the wing's going to come up and arc back that way. So to me, that's just a layout line to me. It may or may not actually become part of a form line. I might change that, but the idea is that the wing's going to come up and go that way. And then for down here, let's suggest that the body might come out into this area, and we'll make a leg that might come up this way, and then a foot that might hang out here like this. And then take a look at that and say, oh, that's okay, but maybe the leg and the foot are a little high. So we're not committed to anything yet, see? That's the thing. So we're just doing little layouts. We're prospecting, so to speak, for where to put these parts. So let's have the leg a little lower and the foot a little lower, down there like that. And then if the wing's out here to balance all that, and we're not going to worry about the wing right this moment because I didn't leave enough room over there for it, but let's look at these difficult parts, the body and leg and foot. So, let me see. What if we make a kind of an ovoid shaped body that might start here? I want to leave some space between this and the head itself. So I'm going to start a little lower. So we'll put like a sideways ovoid. It's going to run down here, but then it's going to turn back here before it meets the tail. That might not be quite big enough, but it might be all right. Yeah, I think I want to bring that line out a little farther. So the same height, but I'm going to bring it out a little bit farther and then curl it back. So then we're going to build a little structure in there. And then I kind of like the placement of this foot, and we'll make the leg fit. We're not going to worry about the leg just yet. So let's briskly put together a little foot here. And the feet are pretty straightforward by themselves, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. We'll put an ovoid here. So here's my layout line, right? There's this little arc, and I'm going to kind of follow that. So I want the ovoid to be at an angle that harmonizes with that arc, and we've got the form line around it. So then I'm going to come off of that and bring some toes forward, and that might come right off the top of the ovoid. So we've got that shape happening there like that. We've got the ovoid, and we have at least the general direction of the talons, toes, whatever out here, and a kind of the fourth digit back here. Then we got the arc of the foot and all that. So then we just have to adapt our raven toes to fit that shape. So we'll just make we'll make 3 little toes, and of course we have to draw the space between them. And keep that open, and then you could use crescents to separate those from the ovoid. That's a common way to do it. And I'll draw it that way. And then that separates the toes from the ovoid shape joint of the foot. But, you know, you can make the foot however you're comfortable with. I might retract that crescent a little bit, it's a little bit far. And then we'll make the back digit come up kind of like a lower jaw. And then we got the inner ovoid, of course, here, but we're not going to worry about that right this second. So then let's go back to the body. And I dropped it down like this because I wanted to use a little U-shape overlap in order to connect the body to the head. I don't know why, I just thought it might be fun. So what I want to do is start an ovoid, a U-shape from up here, the inside edge of it. Will come off the back corner of the jaw and turn right at the top of that body layout line I drew. And then the other side of it will come out, turn off the lower jaw and down, and then also touch just the top. That's the inside edge of this U shape, and it's touching against right on the top of that layout line I drew for the body. So that means then the outside edge of that U shape would, in this case, come down here, and then I'm going to turn it back out this way. So the full outside edge of that U shape would come down and across and back up. So the U shape is overlapped by the body, and that's going to show a real solid connection than if it wasn't. If we just had a U shape, the end of which stopped here and the end of the body stopped there, it would sort of look like a spine that was coming apart, instead of looking connected. It would look like separate pieces bumping into each other. So we'll put a crescent here on this side where that leg of the U shape meets the body. And we'll do the same thing on this side. And so we've got just the legs of a U shape that define the U shape. And then, let me look at that for a second. Well, that could be fun. All right, so it's a little awkward drawing sideways. You can turn your paper, I can't. But what I have in mind is to put a kind of a tall, narrowish ovoid that fits, the inside edge of it fits right there, and I moved this line over, so that'd be close enough. So we'll make the outside edge of it like that. So there's space between the bottom of the ovoid and the back of the body, and there's space between the lower side of the ovoid and the bottom of the body. And the form line around it, at least to some extent, matches the curvature of the top of the body right there. It's a little wide right here, but we can adapt to that with the U shape that's going to come beneath it. So I made the choice right in the beginning of bringing this line all the way back into here, and I'm going to stick with that. We're going to hope that the structure of the body and the structure of the tail will give them enough of the impression of being joined so that it doesn't look like the tail is just going to fall off. Although the only place it actually contacts right now is right back here at the corner of the body, but maybe we can survive that. And we'll just have again, working off the outside bottom form line of that little ovoid there, we'll extend that, in this case down, but forward, and we'll turn it up to meet the rest of the body shape. So the inside edge of that U shape will start on the outside edge of the ovoid form line, and we'll just bring that U shape down this way, and it's not going to be overlapped, it's just going to complete itself right there. So I'll shade that in so it's more obvious. And I'll shade in the ovoid. We'll leave it complete that way. Like that. So because this is essentially an ovoid shape, this is a lot like building those elaborated inner ovoids we were doing before. So then we can use a U shape that's actually running this way that would follow the edge of this. That'll be one edge of it. Then we'll turn it. We don't go too far back. Let's turn it like right here, just below the eye socket, and then all the way over to the back edge of the. Well, we want the inside edge of it to have some thickness, so we'll drop it down right there and taper it down where it meets the tail. Yeah, like that. There. So then we have a kind of a little face structure there, form line face structure, with an eye socket, a snout, and a mouth, and it all fits in this body space. And then we would just build whatever kind of a cheek resolution we wanted to create. And in this case, I think I'll make a U shape coming back from the mouth and a crescent on the corner of the eye socket ovoid like that. And then at the base of that tall U-shape, right now there's just that little fine line that defines the edge of the body. And so we'll just widen that up like a little ligature that arcs up and then tapers down again, like so, to be the base of the U-shape. Because you don't want to leave the U-shape open on the bottom. And it doesn't actually connect to the tail over here. So we need that positive ligature there to complete the Formline structure. So then we just fill in these spaces, right? We've done that before. So now I'm just going to address this foot thing here. So I made this layout line, and again, I'm not going to necessarily exactly follow that, but it gives me a notion that there's a leg that's going to connect here and arc up like this and then come down and connect to the foot. So there's a lot of different ways we could make that work. One way would be to put a little U-shape coming out from the body and then joining back up again like that. Now that crosses that layout line, so I'm not going to worry about the layout line anymore. We're just going to get rid of it. But that gives us an anchor onto the rest of the body, and we could make that kind of broad on the end, or we could make it solid, but I'll make it just broad on the end with a U-shaped space at the base. So it's like a short, wide U-shape. And then let's look at this space for the foot, the leg itself. And let me just glance for a second here, see what I want to do. That might work. So if we, I'll go with the outline and then we'll adapt to it. So what I decided to do is to the leg's only going to touch the foot right here on the kind of top left corner. So I'm going to come off of it. This is an outline. It's not a form line yet. So I'm just going to swing it around and come back to the body and then turn up where it meets that U shape. Look at that and see if that's not too weird. It'll get less weird, I think, as if I keep going. What I might do is raise this part of the curve a little bit more and minimize that part of the curve. And I'm also going to bring the end of the U-shape out a little farther. And even though I'm working in paint, I can get away with that because then I'll just extend it out this way, see? There's a little revision in the middle of the process. Make a little stronger base to attach this leg to. And then the opposite side of that arced leg, I'm going to have like a little bend in it. That's going to come down and meet the back of the foot. Well, it should just come straight down, like that. And then the space between them, that's going to arc up, kind of following the top line, but then it's going to come down and meet the end of that U shape. It's a little awkward, but not that bad. I'm going to make one little minor adjustment here. I want the arc to come up higher and the other thing to come back farther like that. I'm sort of happier with that. So then most of this, we might put a little circle relief right here so it's not too heavy. And otherwise it's going to be filled in as a solid form line. And then here, we'll just use a trigon that splits right up into that space. And meets the end of the U shape. So I'm not going to put that in the hopper as my favorite raven leg I ever drew, but it could be worse. And even if it's a throwaway, we got to build a structure and decide, okay, we can make this work. And if you want to end up adjusting this, feel free. But anyway, that's one sort of set of processes to go about. And then we can finish off the tail. You know, this could be a ovoid shaped joint in the tail. It could be a profile face. It could be a double eye face if we wanted. You put 2 eye sockets and a space between them and a mouth below. And that could be the joint of the tail, and then tail feathers coming down there. So that's pretty straightforward. You have a lot of experience with that already. I think what I would want to do here would be to bring the foot a little closer in so that if I had this to revise, which I do, of course, I think what I would do is I'd have the whole arc of the leg come up a little higher and a little more Formline-like, and then maybe drop down like that to the foot. Anyway, there's possibilities. You could play with that and come up with something that you were happy with. If this needed relief, we could run an ovoid this way, even a crescent right here if you needed, to make that work, and a trigon that came up into here or whatever. See? So, where are we now? After 3. Well, I want to take a quick look at there's a small number of picture here that I think would be fun to see, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each one. We've already seen that one. And I just want to, I just want to emphasize that these things we looked at yesterday and this are in the several hundred-year-old range. I think they actually carbon dated some material inside this box or the wood itself, and the carbon date came back as 600 years old. Although you have to take that with a grain of salt, because carbon dating relatively young things like that aren't 1,000 years and more older is not terribly accurate, because as soon as what carbon-14 dating does is it measures the amount of carbon that was in the atmosphere at the time this tree grew. And with the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the 1740s, 50s, and that on up till today, we've been pumping more and more, coal burning and all that stuff, gasoline, I've been pumping more and more carbon into the atmosphere, so it throws off the whole thing. You can't rely on dates that are since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So things that are older are usually a little more accurate, but anything that's even in the 300 to 1,000 year range is a little more iffy.
I just want to say, because I know it came up earlier as well, I think the idea that iron got the story about iron and how it developed Northwest Coast art can be questioned. Something that James Crippen said to me one time is that there's an indigenous word for iron, claviers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that suggests it could have been around for a while.
Oh yeah.
And that, stories like, of course, with the boards with nails in it from China or whatever,
Right.
could have been hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
There's no question there wasn't a lot of it.
Uh-huh.
But I think that whole story that suddenly things got super complex.
Yeah. All of a sudden.
can be questioned.
Right. No, I think you're
it's
absolutely
maybe
right.
The degree of how complex,
Right.
more complex it got.
Right. Was it the Firesign Theater years ago? I'm showing my age. That did a blurb about history, and they said like when the Mexican native people developed agriculture and developed corn, they said, "Great corn! Now we can make tortillas." Or when the Europeans showed up, great knives and steel adzes. Now we can make totem poles. That's kind of the story as it's been, right?
Yeah.
And it's not really that way. And in fact, the archaeology, like on the coast of Washington, there's a village there that was covered by a mudslide. They figure between 300 and 500 years ago. And they're actually now, that was established in 1970s when they were doing the excavation. And more recent research has revealed that there was a major earthquake off the coast that created a tsunami that hit Japan in January of 1700. And it was a major subduction earthquake off the coast of Washington along the Pacific Fault that might have been what was responsible for the mudslide that covered the village. So it might be just 300 years ago, but nonetheless, they found carving tools, and they found 37 iron or steel bladed carving tools. Now, the steel was all rusted away, but you could tell it was a steel bladed carving tool by the shape of the handle and so on. And only a handful of beaver tooth knives. So there was more iron in use 100 years before Europeans arrived in that village than there were beaver tooth knives. And I read recently a book called The Secret Voyage of Sir Francis Drake by a guy named Samuel Balfe. And it's really interesting because most of history has told us that Drake came up from South America in the 1570s and got as far as Northern California, maybe Oregon, and then went off to the Pacific and back to England. But, in fact, and his original records were lost in a fire in the 1600s, but by going through letters and other information that he sent out to friends of his and whatnot, there's good reason to think, and I think he's probably right, that he actually came up into here as far as Chatham Strait, and he saw all the ice. This was 400 years ago, right? 5 almost. So he was coming, he saw all this ice coming, choking Chatham Strait, because even then there was no Glacier Bay, it was solid ice, and the icy strait was icy, and he thought, he saw that long strait disappearing to the north, choked with ice. He thought that is the west end of the Northwest Passage. And he was sure it was, and he was going to come back later and finish exploring it, so then they could come across North America and all that. So he went up that far and then came down the inside of Vancouver Island and so on. And he's even suggested that he traded with the people at Ozette and Nia Bay, which is why that iron is there. So maybe, who knows? It could maybe be analyzed to tell whether that was European or Asian iron, but nobody had done it yet. So, but yeah, you're right. Between shipwrecks and trade from hand to hand, tribe to tribe across the Bering Sea and all that, or even up from California at a certain point, because Spanish iron down there, there was a lot of it here, because even the first Europeans saw that people were carrying iron and steel knives that were cold hammered and all that, obviously native made from some other source of the material. So yeah, it was around a long time before Europeans showed up, and then suddenly they brought more of it. So anyway, we looked at that and the archaic nature of it. This is another old archaic one. Could as well be Tsimshian as Tlingit, in fact, but I won't spend a lot of time on that because I want to get to some of the other things. Now, here's an interesting comparison, though, between these compositions, and here you can see the head in each of these panels. This is I believe this is the front, the sides, and the back, but it could be the other way. This could be the front. I think that it. And you can see here are red inner ovoids down here, which is interesting because he just didn't want all that black right there, so he made them red. But, and here's inside the body over here on the sides. Here there's ovoids and formlines. Here there's feather type shapes and stuff. Here there's a big solid red square. Weird, eh? But anyway, so here's this ovoid shaped head, and it has a little bit of an arc across here. And then the upper jaw has a little bit more arc. And then the eye sockets are parallel to that. So even from the lower jaw to the upper jaw to the eye socket, you can see these non-parallel lines building this way, see? And that's the same in all four of those sides of the same box by the same painter. And then if we look at this one, here the lower jaw has a little arc to it, not much comes across, dips down in the middle, interestingly, so that the tongue can hang almost like across it, but not. But then the eye sockets have this real powerful arc to them like this. And the ovoids in the upper corner are tilted even more. And then the ovoids down here are tilted the other way. And this, although it's almost or close to, could be the same age as the other one, this is a real 18th century looking thing. There's a whole lot of more dynamic in this composition than in those other ones. So some artists took advantage of those principles, some don't. But this is old enough you can see the cheek design is plain red. The inner ovoid here has just an ovoid shape relief, just an ovoid. So there's no, later, 100 years later, this eye would have a profile face in it. This eye would have a profile face in it. And this double eye is very simple. It's just a slit and two eye sockets, a trigon. But later that might have thinner form lines and more going on in it, see? But anyway, it's an older one. And the mask-like face there is very mask-like. And it's actually a little more Tsimshian looking than Tlingit looking. So I would guess that's probably a Tsimshian chest, even though it's got these massive, archaic, old-style form lines that people always want to call Tlingit. Now, and this one, in fact, in the Transforming Image book, is called Tlingit. They labeled it Tlingit because it's got these heavier form lines. There's a raven, or appears to be a raven here, body, wing feathers going like this. And then there's the bear and the human figure crouching within it. And if you look at the face of this bear and the way that is structured and the way the lips come right out of the crease in the cheek the way they do, they're not continuous, you know, lips don't go all the way around. There's an upper and a lower, and they tuck into the cheek. Well, I can find very easily Tsimshian frontlets of a bear that look, I mean, they don't necessarily have this figure here, but the sculpture of the face is just like this. I mean, I don't have any doubt that this is Tsimshian work. But because it had this heavier form lines, it's been labeled more than once, Tlingit. This is in the British Museum. I'm not sure where it was collected or when, and it's much smaller than I thought. It's only about that big. I thought it was like this, but it's not. When you see it in person, and they actually have it on display in the British Museum, at least they did 10 years ago. But anyway, so this is Tsimshian style, so, but at an earlier period than what most people are used to. And so it wasn't identified as Tsimshian. But interesting, here's that most common structure, the red cheek design, ovoid shape relief in the eye. Here's the nice little ovoid nostril thing in the beak and stuff like that. So you start looking at these objects and you can see and get a lot of nice ideas for how to fill space. So now suddenly, this is a very different looking chest than the ones we just saw that have basically the same structure. So if we back up just a little bit to here, we got the head, the ovoid in the upper corner, slight beaky turn down there, but the ovoids are upside down. Ovoid in the lower corner, the body, a panel on each side of the head of secondary stuff, secondary work on each side of the body. And That other one is a completely different approach. But here's the same basic structure. Here's a head in the middle, a secondary panel on each side of the head, ovoid in the upper corner, ovoid in the lower corner, body in the middle, secondary panel in the body and on either side of it. But in relation to the size of the head, look how much thinner the form lines are. That other one, they were like this wide, and consequently what was within it was smaller, and the carved out spaces were smaller and so on. So this is from maybe the 1830s or 40s, where the others were from the 1760s, 70s, 80s, something like that. So this could be 50, 60 years later, 2-3 generations, and in each of those generations, artists were kind of stretching the envelope a little bit and saying, well, look, Uncle's gone now. I can do this the way I want. So look here, instead of a plain red cheek design, here's one U-shape, another U-shape, an ovoid in the end of it, subsecondary within that the red, solid red body panels that we saw in that other one. Here's a whole little formline face, 2 eyes, a mouth with teeth, ears, feet here, elaborated eye, profile face in these corner, profile face in this corner. Instead of just a simple stack of 3 U-shapes over here like we saw in the other one, there's a whole little complex of a profile face in form line and so on. In the mouth, there's a whole complex and so on. So by making the form lines thinner and the spaces between them bigger, there's room for all this extra development. But neither the main structure itself nor the extra development, they haven't changed the form line system. They've just injected more of it in all the little places. So, and this is probably Haida work. This is that sort of medium thin form lines and certain kind of combinations and whatnot that are the Haida artists influencing each other and yet staying within a certain kind of set of limits. Here's another Haida chest, although this was collected in Sitka in 1883, something like that. It was a Haida, and there are a lot of Haida chests that through traditional trade and gifting and respect were given from one group to another. But this is really a Haida style thing, and there's other chests that you can recognize by this same unnamed artist that are here and there, and one of them came from Tla'aquan. It shows up in the old 1895 pictures in the Whale House. It's now in the Burke Museum. Same carver did this one. And when they sold that to Emmons, they said, this is a Haida chest. We got it from the Haida. And so he labeled it as Haida chest. But anyway, this is the same carver. It was in Sitka. Now, how it got in Sitka, I don't know. But, and interestingly, there was a little breakage up here. And so they took an eagle quill and split it and then sewed it over the break. And I've seen that more than once. It's an interesting thing. Anyway, so this is the same kind of thing. Not quite as elaborate as the last one, but it's along the same lines. More unparalleledness going on there. Full elaborated thing here. Red complex here. Not just a plain red cheek design here. Simple tongue, mask-like face, hands and stuff. And there's more going on in it. But each of the more goings on is another little form line complex. So it's not technically any different than the others. There's just more room for detail. And then here's, this is actually a Hailtzuk, or Bella Bella, from Bella Bella itself. Farther down, a guy named, they called him Captain Carpenter because he was not only a carver, but a boat builder and other stuff. But look how thin these form lines are. And it's the same structure, big head, arc, now the whole lower jaw and everything arcs way over. And you got going on, and then the ovoid in the upper corner is at a slightly lower angle. Ovoid in the lower corner is a higher angle. There's more space in here. Look how small these inner ovoids are. They're just tiny little lozenge things inside that big form line there. But they still have the fine line around it in the inner ovoid and the space around it carved out and painted blue. But now there's more blue on there than there is black or red. And it's because the form lines have been made so much thinner, the spaces between them bigger, so the hollowed out spaces are bigger, and there's painted blue. There's blue not only around these ovoids, but within them as well. So it's just this huge increase, and it's a complete reversal of the color distribution. Now this is a modern painting. This is Joe David, as I mentioned him yesterday, a Tlaoqueat artist, but he likes and is very expert with northern style form line, but these are even thinner. I mean, look at the bottom of that ovoid there. It's just a fine line, really, next thing to it, and these as well. It's unfinished, as you can see. It was penciled on and then hand painted, but look at the size of that space, and then he's got a lot. There's a whole tertiary half a U shape there, a tertiary half a U shape there. So if there was blue in this, there'd be a whole lot. There'd be more blue than there is black and red put together. But it's the same structure, not just an ovoid in the upper corner, but a whole ovoid complex right there, and another one within that U shape, whole form line complex, hand, more complex form line work in the cheeks and so on like that. Thinner, thinner, thinner.
Seems like all his spine lines are all red no matter what.
Yeah, I guess you're right. He's really into the red, isn't he, there? Yeah.
Well, I guess
Yeah,
right
you're
up
right.
there, and there's a U, and he did put it in the other side.
Where?
You see where the black U is there?
Uh-huh.
There's-
Oh, yeah, it's penciled in,
Oh,
though.
it's
I can see it penciled in, yeah. He just didn't finish this side as much. But that's when I was around and took the picture. It wasn't done yet. Then this is an old thing. I'm not sure where it's from. Not sure how to identify where it's from. And it's a real unusual painting because they put that red border all the way around. And then this is a completely original structure here. It's not like any other conventionalized one. It's really thin, graceful form lines moving around in a very original way. And then it's a little harder to see, but here in red, including the inner ovoids, is a whole little, it's a funny kind of an L-shaped space there on each side. And they devised a form line complex that very gracefully filled that space and yet left a lot of unpainted space around it as it went. Same here, there's a little profile creature head there, a form line complex in here, where in this case the top of the ovoid tapers out to nothing, and it's this kind of funny bent out leg U shape comes all the way across here, and that has overlapped the top of those ovoids. The tiny inner ovoids and a big distance from the fine line in each case, and then the big, really off-centered, non-concentric ovoids that make up the ovoid shape relief, and then similarly thin, graceful, delicate stuff over here. Really, really unusual box. And then I had some things that painted on leather here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but this is an old Tlingit one, possibly from Sitka. It's in Russia. It was from an early Russian collection, the early 19th century. And again, massive form lines. There's hardly any, in fact, there's no red is there on the leather, just on the lips of the mask itself. It's a wooden mask with leather pectoral fins, like a whale, and leather tail, and fine line tertiary U-shapes painted blue, even though it's not carved out, it's painted blue, and so on. Mask-like face here, but even the lips and nose are black, not red. Great thing. And then a small piece of leather that was actually called a gambling mat, so that there would be some kind of like beaver teeth dice or bone dice or something that would be thrown on this mat for a gambling game. And it's not very big, it's probably only this tall. And it was folded in half right here for storage, I guess. But, you know, if we look at these structures, that heavy form lines and whatnot like that, neat little spiral there coming off of the U shape, fine line U-shape, painted blue, etc. here. Big red complex, black inner ovoids, ovoid shape reliefs, mask-like face in the eyes here instead of a double eye formline face like there is up here. You went to mask-like faces down here. And so on, another little curl right there and a ligature to meet the corner. Leg of a U-shape coming up that's overlapped by this and so on. Here's a fine line, blue around it, but no inner ovoid. That's interesting. You don't often see that.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Has anybody determined how to play those games?
Some of them have been recorded, but others not, and I don't know what went with this one. It was just referred to in the Russian records as a gambling mat. This is a piece of leather armor, killer whale, red form lines. First example we've seen that was entirely red form line. Big, tall dorsal fin. Where's my pointing stick? And the head wraps around the other side. That's not the end of it there. It just kept going and wrapped around the other side of the armor. They just used a big ovoid shape for the body, tall dorsal fin, big wide tail. So he probably drew the outline of the tail and then adapted these form lines to fit it. Fine line U-shape with a squashed circle and oval relief in it. So this has the kind of proportions and look of a chilkat weaving, chilkat design. You could rearrange this on a pattern board and it could be woven in chilkat style, because here's the circles inside the U-shapes, square cornered U-shapes and so on like that. And so this is from the period when chilkat weaving developed. There's another piece of Tlingit armor. This, let's see. The last one I think is in the Museum of Natural History in New York. This is in the Phoebe Hearst Museum in Berkeley. And I don't know what this creature is here. And look at the difference between the leg and the hand on this side and the leg on this side. He went to two completely different possibilities. Upside down formline face here. There's another formline structure here. Got a U-shape dropping down into the mouth. Mask-like face up here that's not overlapped, and then part of a U-shape coming down here, half a U-shape filled like that. Real interesting composition. Absolutely square, rectangular, I should say, face in the body like a chilkat weaving again. So the size of the secondary pieces, the use of the design forms and all that is just like what you'd see, even the circle reliefs in chilkat weaving. So probably this painter is one of the ones that was called upon to create pattern boards from which the first chilkat robes were woven, and then that became a solid tradition and stayed that way, even though the rest of the painted tradition changed. And you didn't see the circle reliefs and so on. And this little row of circles here, another thing you sometimes see in chilkat weaving. So this painter, whoever he was, probably painted pattern boards, and here are two red inner ovoids. So he switched from red primary, suddenly he's got black primary there, and he switched the inner ovoids all the way to red, where the others are all black. Crescent reliefs in the ovoids, the profile face in those. A little closer detail of it, but it doesn't change anything. Little shamanic kind of charms sewn onto the thing. For spiritual protection, there's one of them. Here you can see the texture of the painting a little better on the leather there. And the way these, here, two squared off tertiary U-shapes here and here, circle relief, and then the cross-hatched U-shape. That's a rare example of it from something this early to see cross-hatching. This one is in Switzerland, I think. A nice piece of leather garment, tunic kind of thing, with a killer whale arching over what could be a rock or an island or something else, with a mask-like face. And if we look at the head there, how he used an ovoid-shaped head, but he put this round ovoid out here, The cheek structure is interesting. Then the pectoral fin here, and he just went to a simple body form of a wide arcing form line pierced by circles with fine lines in each, circles in each one, and then a series of form line S shapes that represent ribs, and that was the whole body form. Now you could have used this same wide curving area for the body and composed form lines that filled that space, but he chose not to. And dorsal fin with, again, secondary red form lines in it, red secondary U-shapes here, and tertiary splits and so on. And then a really thin form line example. Those others were older Tlingit works. This is Bella Bella, actually probably the same guy that painted that Bella Bella chest. And this is a painted skin, wings, body, and tail of a bird that would have been fastened on the back of a mask, a sculptural bird mask. And then this would have hung down the back. But if we look at the structures of it and how thin those form lines are, I mean, they're just really, really, really thin compared to the size of the shapes they define, see? And then secondary structures in red within all those black shapes, pretty complex ones at that, and yet they're also composed of thin form line U shapes and so on. And then a couple of interesting contemporary works. This is Robert Davidson from the early 70s, and he calls this circle a killer whale. So we've got this broad head with a broad snout, a blowhole here, so it suggests the whale. And so here's the head, here's the teeth, but there is no lower jaw per se, see? There's this thing that you could call the tail, you could call it a pectoral fin. I'm not sure what he would call it, but it's made up of a big ovoid there, fine line inner ovoid. Here he used a black secondary U-shape here with a red fine line, kind of pulled a switch on us, and a red secondary U-shape there with a red fine line. But it's the edge of that pectoral fin, whatever it is, that creates the lower jaw. So the lower jaw was there, like it would maybe ordinarily be, but then that pectoral fin comes up and overlaps it, and he eliminated that line. So instead of having to make this all that much smaller in order to squeeze in the lower jaw, he just moved it up, effectively overlapped the lower jaw, and kept the teeth, and you don't really notice that it's missing, because it all works, see? Nice thing.
Strange how you put the trigons on the blowhole where they're not.
Yeah.
Making a form line.
Well, they are. It's right on the back edge of this one.
Well,
It's on the outside edge of that one. He's got the ligature here. He's got the form line of the back of the mouth turning down there. So they really do follow the edges of form line. And then the circle here that breaks it up, and another trigon over here that works with this ligature and that little part of a U-shape type thing there. Negative U-shape here that would be painted blue if any of it was, with a fine line and then secondary U-shapes within it, like we did over here. Here's another simple eagle design in a circle. Again, here's the head, the beak, and the wing. And again, he brought the wing up till it overlapped the lower jaw. So there is no separate lower jaw, because if there was, it just would have had made this all smaller, and there would have been parallel the lower jaw and the edge of the wing. So rather than gum it all up like that, he just eliminate the lower jaw and let the edge of the wing take its place. A simple ovoid out here. He didn't bother to mark the edge of the ovoid here. So you don't always have to. The back of the head and the trigon coming back here, ovoid here. And then he did a funny thing here. Here's the U shape, and you can see how the outside edge of the leg of it's pretty broad, the end of it's a little narrower, and then the other corner of it would actually be down here off the circle. He just eliminated it. So he made the inside edge of the U shape come almost right out to the edge of the circle, and back so that it maintained its normal shape, and the outside edge of it, it went with the circle, see? But it works, you don't really notice that. And then the inside stuff, he made the tertiary line here in red, and he made it off center instead of being in the middle so that the negative U-shape was the same width on each side. He made one side wide and one side very narrow by just taking this whole secondary complex and sliding it off to one side. And yet I don't know that I've ever seen that in any old work, but it works, it looks fine, no problem with it. And here's the one place in the old work where you do, and frequently in Haida work, where you do see solid split U's. And that's when they're at the end of a little complex where there's this two U-shapes, and the base is a shorter U-shape, and extended on it is another solid U-shape, but instead of a crescent at the base like this, there's a trigon at the base, so it splits the solid U-shape. But other than that, in contemporary work you see it often, but in the old work, that's one of the few places, that kind of a complex, where you see a solid red split U, or in this case black because the main form lines are red. Anyway, interesting thing, those are done as silkscreen prints, and I just thought I'd encourage people by showing how they started out, because he's known for very precise, those were, small silk screens blown up, and they were early ones, so now he's using, and even shortly after this, much thinner fine lines and all that kind of stuff, more small detail, and he's known for that precision, that real tight tension precision. But in these sketches, it's Robert Davidson, the loose one, So he's sketching with his pencil and stuff. So here's a version of the killer whale before it was finished. And you can see he changed it around. There's no blowhole here. The ovoid is off to one side, and he ended up with it in the middle of this space. Here's the jaw turns around there, and then is overlapped by this part of the pectoral fin, and then this is actually the jaw extending out beyond that here. But he eventually decided to totally eliminate the lower jaw and change it. But here in this sketchy version, you have the genesis of the idea. Here's the one version of the eagle before it was done. Here's another version of the eagle, another version of the eagle before they were finished. So don't feel bad if your designs aren't all perfect and precise like that, because his don't start out that way either. Yeah.
How do you compare silk screens and now computers with the human touch? What's your personal opinion on that?
Oh, between a silkscreen print and a G-clay?
Well, silk screen and computers and just that sort of really precise graphic design style.
Yeah.
And the human touch. What do you?
Well, you mean as opposed to painting?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I gave it much thought. Between silk screens and G-clay, I don't see much difference, because the artist's creativity went into, and technically, that's almost never the case. In Robert's case, he does it that way sometimes. But technically, a silk screen is supposed to be cut from a painted original. So if you paint the original, then the silk screen creator, which is often not the artist, Robert used to do it. In fact, in that period, he did all his own stuff, pulled his own prints, but not very many artists do. They take it to a professional silk screener who reproduces the design, cuts the film, and prints the screen. But it's technically a serigraph is supposed to be made off a completed painting. But hardly anybody has ever done that in the 40, 50-year history of silkscreen prints on the Northwest Coast. They draw it out in pencil, and then the silkscreen artist, the silkscreen professional, will take that pencil drawing and cut the film from that, sometimes tidying up the lines as he goes, and then print the screen. So it's kind of like the artist didn't do it. And in the case of a giclée, you start with a painted original most likely, and you might scan that, and then you have to vectorize that with a a CAD program, and then input that into your printer and knock out the print. See? But I don't see that as being that much different than what happens to a typical silkscreen print. But the difference between those and a hand painting is huge. And the hand painting, whether it's on paper or canvas in this style or on wood, to me is like you say, it's the human touch. And you can feel the warmth of it and all that. And you don't often get that from, I mean, it depends on the artwork, but it can come through in a silkscreen or a giclée, but it's more present in a hand painting, I think. Anyway, so now this is Don Yeomans, another Haida artist, and I wanted to show these because this is something that I used to say never existed in the old stuff, and then I found an example of it. So like there's really nothing new in any of this. It's all 600,000 years old. But he took, there's positive and negative space, right? So he's got black positive and white negative space in this side of the yin-yang, but on this side he painted just the negative spaces and left the positive spaces unpainted. So it looks like white form lines on a black background. And this is black form lines on a white background. And it's a mirror image of each other. He did this in like 79, maybe something like that. And in fact, he didn't actually invent this. There's I would describe as a sometimes friend of mine, because he's like the tide. He comes in and goes out, Anyway, a guy named Barry Harum, who once did a silkscreen work. He was a silkscreen artist, he considered himself, and he liked silver work, but he couldn't do silver work. And he wanted to do a silkscreen print of silver work, so he took silver shiny paper and printed on it in black, printing the negative spaces, like this is, so that instead of black negative on a white background, it was black negative on a silver background. So it looked like an engraving where all the cutout spaces had oxidized black. And the design itself was okay, but the concept was there, that you paint the negative spaces, not the positive. So it's the opposite of the ancient tradition. And so then Yeomans, a year or so later, started playing with the same idea. And these are a couple of versions of his results. Here's the white raven and the black raven, but here painting the negative spaces. And then, as always has happened in this tradition, other artists saw these two guys doing this stuff, and everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And now, this, what I like to, for lack of a better word, negative form lines, now you see this a lot. People use this a lot. And it almost never existed before, although there's a Tlingit shaman's mask that I think is originally from Haines, that's now in Houston, and it's a real kind of strange, spooky, bony looking mask with cut through eyes. I mean, even the eyelid lines are cut through, and a big long nose sticking out. And it's mostly solid blue, the mask, like a lot of Tlingit masks are. And then he painted some little U-shapes on the side of the eye socket, but he didn't paint the U-shapes, he painted the negative spaces. So he's got red crescents and red fine lines that are the negative spaces, and it looks like blue U-shapes on a blue field. And I thought, wow, those are negative form lines. And that's like an 18th century at least mask. So they've been around for 250 years, but it took until recently for anybody else to try that. And I don't know, I don't think either of them got the idea from that mask, but there it was, and I was kind of shocked when I realized that that's what it was. Anyway, here's another example where he took quite clever, I thought, where he's got the Thunderbird in positive form lines, and within the body of the Thunderbird, he put a killer whale in negative form line, so that this tertiary U-shape in the wing, which is ordinarily a standard positive U-shape with a negative U-shape around it, is actually the dorsal fin of the negative killer whale. And it works. So he's got the negative U-shapes in the ovoids here, and that extends into the secondary area of the positive black U-shapes of the tail. I find that kind of mind-blowing. And I've never even tried this kind of stuff, so I've never worked with negative U-shapes. I don't know why, I just haven't stepped in that direction. But a lot of other artists have. And this is the same guy, Don Yeomans. This is a drum he painted in memory of his father. So he's got a lot of interesting things going on. He's got solid black background, red form lines right on the black, and then negative form lines, that is the drum head itself, showing through. So he didn't paint the whole thing black, only the areas that weren't, well, you know what I mean. I don't know how to describe it, but anyway, he's got
What is
it.
he?
He's Haida.
Haida.
Yeah, his father's Haida. And anyway, so it's a combination of red form lines on black with negative elements within it, and then this whole little area that's a whole negative form line thing going on. It's pretty interesting stuff anyway. I think that's the last one, huh? Yeah. So, how much time we got left? Not much? Oh, none. We're in fact a minute or so over time. I think I'm fast a little bit. So is there anything else we can do real quick before we all escape?
How about the difference in eyes?
Oh, the difference in eyes, good point. And I meant to do that earlier and I forgot. So, and it's an interesting topic because the eyelid shapes themselves are, even though they all seem to be the same, is one of the primary ways that you can look at a piece of work from any time period and connect it to others by the same carver or artist, because people generally fall into a certain way of doing things, and even though they're only subtle changes from one to another, one artist to another, they're usually fairly consistent, and so you can pick out those changes. So if I made a number of eye ovoids here, and it's also a way that you can tell that you can at least partly tell the difference between tribal groups, because as artists work together in a certain area, whether it's a village or a whole region of the same language group, they tend to do the same kinds of things. So I first mentioned the points of the eyelid going through the lower third of the eye ovoid or circle itself, and that's still often the case, but what differs is how much people follow the ovoid around before they turn out to go to the tip. And I refer to that to how much the eyelid line is pinched. So if you took that eyelid line and pinched it a little bit more, it would look more like this. And then coming back the other way, I'll try to make it more or less the same. And coming back the other way, this might be kind of narrow and then fan out to cross the bottom, following again the shape of the ovoid for a ways before they come back out. And so this is what I'm talking about, pinching the eyelid this way. And Haida and Tsimshian artists in general tend to pinch the eyelids more than Tlingit artists do. So that's one sort of halfway consistent thing you can look at. Where, and some would actually pinch it more than that. I mean, you see some examples, and again, you can find trinket ones that are the same way, where, so it's not a universal thing that you can say, but you might see a eye on a mask, something where they might pinch the eyelid really completely in, so that it ends up looking like that. So it's really tight around the eye itself. Pinch, 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 see? But you're just as likely on a trinket mask with a round eye, say, to see an eyelid that is really wide open, maybe even this far wide open. Like that. And it's kind of the complete opposite of this. And I really exaggerated this, but there's a certain trinket artist that actually did it this way. So the degree of that is one thing that differs a lot. So some eyelids, and most usually trinket ones, they don't have actually even have a reverse curve in them at all. Some of them look like this. They're wide open and often shorter than these others. So actually this might, thank you for turning that off, I forgot about it. It might, be shorter than that. But these wide open eyelids as opposed to tightly pinched ones, it's a much more common Tlingit trait than it is Haida or Tsimshian. And then of course the distance at the bottom between the eye itself and the fine line differs a lot too. So some artists might have an arc, might have straight points that arc over the top, and then maybe the only reverse is right at the very end, and the rest of the line comes across like so, and then slight reverse at the tip. Now this one's a little too long compared to the other, but so this would, to be more symmetrical about it, would come down this way, but then a very slight reverse where that comes down. And so when you see all these differences, and many artists will pick, they'll find something that's comfortable and stick with it, they become pretty consistent about it. And you can distinguish one artist's work from another a lot of times just based on the eyelid lines alone. But you have to really take everything into account. So, does that cover what you were thinking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, see the difference.
Anybody else have a question?
Well, you have to consider different when you're working with something that has no color, like with
Right.
silver.
Right.
You
It's
end
a
up
different
carving
challenge.
things out that you shouldn't.
Well, you don't have to.
I mean, I've seen it where they
Yeah.
cut out whole units that weren't supposed to.
Oh,
cut
well,
out.
yeah, if you do it wrong.
Like this, everything is the same color.
Right. Yeah, it is challenging that way, and you have to design a little bit differently too, because you don't have the contrast with the background. All you have is the texture. Same with argillite, really. So you have to design those textured spaces so that makes the design itself jump out. Otherwise, it's hard to tell the design from the background, isn't it? It's all the same.
Because if I have the different ones, I'll mark it with my marking pencil,
Oh, yeah.
so I know a pen where I know where to come back and make sure I
Uh-huh.
texture the stuff to
Yeah.
show up.
Yeah,
Because they're so close together, if you go
Right.
over the line, you ruin
yeah,
all that work.
yeah. Yeah, it's challenging for sure. Right from the design part. You have to plan a design for engraving or argillite this, it's sort of a slightly different way. You have to design more background into it and then space those out so it works in there. Well, great. I really appreciate what everybody did. I'm sorry we didn't create more time to come and look what people are doing, but what I did glance around and see, it looks like there's a lot of great understanding and hopefully, yeah, that's great. Hopefully this has been a help and can come. You might remember some of this when you're trying to work out a design and finish it or whatever. And hopefully in the future, we can do longer sessions like this so that we got more time to work on an individual basis, which is something we missed out on this time. But anyway, thanks a lot for coming. It was fun for me, and I really appreciate being here.